Hi, I'm Matta Spencer. Today we are going to have a schmooze day, and usually what happens is, we're supposed to put people together who don't necessarily know each other and don't necessarily have anything in common. But usually I can kind of guess at what people are going to talk about because I know them, and this time I absolutely can't. I'm not even sure who else is going to be with us, but I do know two people who are already here. There may be two others who will join us later. But these two people, I sure don't know what they're going to find to talk about, but we're going to discover what we have in common or what we want to avoid in common, maybe. Okay, in Irvine, California, introduce yourself, please. Arthur Edelstein is a specialist in computer privacy. And he has a great interest in nonviolence. So his work with people in nonviolence is what I thought we might wind up putting some other people on the show with, but we don't. So hello, Art. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing great, Meta. Thanks. I'm not quite sure how to introduce myself. I guess I've had a few random interests in my life. One of them is nonviolent struggle and that area. And another thing that I've been doing since I was a kid is playing with computers. And I have sort of, in recent years, those two hobbies have kind of converged into a bit of an obsession. And so I work primarily on privacy on the web, specifically trying to improve web browsers, which are the way that everybody connects to the web, and fix them because they leak a lot of personal data, maybe more personal data than anything else leaks currently. And I feel that it's important for a number of reasons, but part of that has to do with allowing people to act freely. If you are being spied on, then that affects your freedom. So if we can make sure that we don't have mass surveillance at some point, then maybe we have a hope of being able to resist authoritarians.
Bruce Flattery is a professor of English at York University. And so please tell us what you're interested in, Bruce.
My interest is in nonviolence, and I was hoping that that's what we would talk about.
Okay.
It's a personal interest, and it's developed in the background. English professors are not necessarily nonviolent. I actually retired from teaching at York in 2008, and I taught for a few years a course, but I haven't taught at York for a few years now. And I'm living my second career, which is I'm a Scientology auditor for about 20 years, actually for about 50 years, but sort of professionally, I suppose, or professionally since 2003. And the aims of Scientology include a world without war, although Scientology is not widely known, I guess, for being a peace advocate one way or the other, but I am kind of, not widely known, but that's what I am. And I have been off and on since I grew up in the States. So we have
what town?
I live south of Buffalo in rural New York State.
Okay.
I grew up in a town called, quaintly enough, Little Valley. And it was a little valley. There were 1,100 people, 30 in my class at school from kindergarten to grade 12 and so on. And I went to Georgetown. And then I came to Canada just by accident to do a PhD in 1964. So my political life sort of is in the US up to 64 and close to the US border since 1964. And finally becoming a Canadian citizen after 9/11, because getting back across the border in various directions turned out to be easier if you're a citizen of both countries. But I'm sort of obsessed with the Ukraine mess. And I've been trying to figure out what I personally could do one way or another. And 3 or 4 years ago, maybe, I mean, I've always, as I think I told you, subscribed to Peace Magazine. So I've known you indirectly off and on. Some months I read it, some years I don't, but I support it and I kind of know the personalities. And I can't even guess how long I've been getting Peace Magazine. But also in the 60s, my brother was drafted and I had already got out of the draft one way or another. So I went for his farewell party, I guess. And no one had ever asked him whether he wanted to go or not. So I asked him and he said no. And then we got him out of the draft eventually. So I got involved in the late 60s with the Toronto, anti-Vietnam movement and the draft board and the backlines to Robert Kennedy's office and all the kinds of things they had to be involved in. And I got reclassified by my angry draft board as eligible for the draft after, going with my brother to explain how he had become a conscientious objector.
You mean you think they did it to get even?
Oh, I know that. I know that. They told me as much. They changed my status from 3A to 1A, but I didn't get drafted as it happened. And I was in Canada anyway, so I was safe.
You could have stayed.
I did stay, I was living here. So, for a long time, I guess I've been interested in putting an end to war. And in recent years, I've been more active in a group called World Beyond War.
Yes, they had a big conference here about three years ago or 4.
Yeah.
And they're really an effective outfit.
Well, I joined just after that, I think. So I'm using them mainly to network and to educate myself and so on.
I can tell you that there are 2 other people who might show up, but may not, probably won't. One would really add a certain strange element to this conversation. He was my taxi driver about a couple of years or 3 ago, and he's from Uganda, and he was talking about various kinds of social improvement organizations that he was engaged with in Uganda. And so he's been on the Global Town Hall a couple of times. I invited him to join, and then he called me a couple of weeks ago or less and said that his king is coming to Toronto, and would I like to interview his king on my talk show? And it seems, I didn't know that Uganda had kings, but they do. And this king is coming, and I'm going to have a conversation with him. So I don't think the king will join us this morning, but it's possible that George Willobo will. And if he doesn't, well, we'll get him another time. But I just love the combination of Scientologists and the king of Uganda. It could be interesting to see if there's any conceivable role for nonviolent struggle in the current war in Uganda. That's going to be hard. Anybody want to take a swing at that?
No.
Well, maybe I'll try a little bit. So there's the thing that got me into nonviolent struggle was when I discovered Gene Sharp's writings, and he was a really amazing thinker and probably sort of unique, at least at that time, in how he thought about nonviolence or nonviolent struggle. But one of his books, which is probably the most radical book, is called Civilian-Based Defense. And so he has a proposal for how a country could defend itself from a foreign invasion without resorting to violent defense. And he has a couple of historical examples in the book. And I don't remember them very well because it's been a long time since I read it. But one of them, I think, was the invasion of the Ruhr by Prussia. and that would have been 100 years ago at least. And I don't remember the details, but there's not a whole lot of historical examples. So in some ways, the proposal is a bit more out there than some of his other books, which are focused on people resisting their own governments in their own country. But I think it's really important to think about radical things because we have an extreme problem, and I don't know if it could work in the Ukraine case, but it seems like it's not something, it seems like we should be discussing that as a possibility. Maybe it was possible earlier and it's not possible now, or maybe it would even be possible now. I don't know, but I think it's a really interesting idea.
Do you remember what tactics he recommends?
Well, I think it's, I mean, I can think of specific examples. He tends to sort of start with the strategic part and then give examples of tactics, but being careful to say, the tactics depend on the situation, and he's not going to prescribe the tactics. I think the idea is that if you're if a country is invading another country, they need some amount of cooperation from people in the country they're invading in order to successfully invade it or occupy it, or at least they need acquiescence of enough people. And if you could have mass resistance where everyone is refusing to cooperate and making the lives of the invaders as difficult as possible, maybe they will invade, but they won't really achieve their objectives, whatever those objectives might be. And I remember, examples like refusing to speak to the occupiers, maybe pretending you don't speak their language, right?
Right. Yeah.
Taking away all of the street signs so that they can't find a way, right? Things like that. But probably you need a whole lot of tactics that are not just these little individual things, but you need a strategy where the government of the invaded country has a real plan and is, at a high level, they have they've chosen the tactics that they think will work for their situation.
Yeah.
Actually, when the invasion began, there was a brief period in which I was arguing, not forcibly, because I didn't, nobody thought I was to be taken seriously, but I did mention this notion. I thought that the Russian troops were going to be so overwhelmingly powerful that there's no way that Ukraine could defend itself militarily. So I thought back to the situation of the Danes in World War II, where that is probably the best example of a country defending itself against invaders, although not keeping them out, but keeping their identity and their lifestyle and their values functioning. And so what I proposed is, instead of wasting all those lives, that Zelensky should see all these troops on the border and the tanks and say, well, come on in. We can't stop you. And we know you're going to run things. So come on in. But we have to warn you, you're not going to get any cooperation from us. And with a lot of preparation in advance, and to make this work, you really need to plan before the invasion. And that's one of the things that Gene Sharp mentioned. And by the way, I also knew Gene Sharp. So I'm in the position of having a good friendship with Ron Hubbard and Gene Sharp in my day. But I don't think there's any connection between those two guys. Anyway, what I would have done at that point is I would have tried to get people organized in advance so they would all know whom to connect with. And then they, what the Danes did, the Germans thought that the Danes were great shipbuilders. Well, they were. And so they thought they would go in and occupy Denmark and make them create warships for Germany. But so they had to have a soldier standing behind everybody who was working on the ship, making sure that he did the work. So he would screw in the screw, and the minute the soldier's back was turned, he'd unscrew it again, And they worked, they absolutely didn't complete one ship in the whole war. And they had all kinds of things about, you don't understand when a German tries to talk to you, you don't understand what they're saying. You never share anything with them. You never sell them anything. They had a whole list of about 50 things that you never do, and people didn't do it. And it really made it impossible. Well, now the reality is that somebody pointed out that it would take at least 1 million Russian soldiers to occupy a country, to really occupy a country the size of Ukraine, which is 40 million people, something like that.
Yep.
And so they can't occupy it really anyway, even if the Ukrainians don't organize. But if the Ukrainians organized in advance and said, okay, come on in, we can't stop you, and they could make it impossible for the Russian army to accomplish whatever objectives they have. So I would have thought that would be a life-saving situation. Now, in terms of saving the identity and the security of Ukraine as a country, I don't know how long that would work. They wouldn't be in control of their own country. They wouldn't be able to make political decisions about any international commitments. But you could make it difficult for an invader and not worth their while, really, to come on in. But nobody took that seriously. And then immediately, the Ukrainians started winning the war. Well, they're not winning the war anymore. And as I understand it, the time when you get a ceasefire and a truce and real negotiations going is when both sides still think, they can't win, but they know, the other side isn't winning either. It's a stalemate. So it may be that if there's a long enough stalemate, and a significant stalemate, that there'll be an opportunity to have some kind of negotiated solution. But I don't think that's within sight right now.
Maybe there was an opportunity to do something like that, but planning would have been really necessary. And it really goes back to at least 2014. Because there was some war already happening then. And I think, that kind of entrenched that view that this was a military problem for Ukraine even then. So it's very hard to see now how you could switch over to a nonviolent strategy, how that could be politically doable.
Why didn't they accept the Minsk agreement? There are 2 Minsk agreements, but anything would have been better than what they have now. The countries are going to be rubble, even if they so-called win the war.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is that this isn't just a Russia-Ukraine problem. It's a world problem. I guess World Beyond War is getting me to think that way. So that, it's of interest to us that all the US and Canada supplied weaponry is, ruining the environment at the rate that rush hour in Toronto doesn't, and so on. So everyone on the planet has an interest in this mess. And this has been true for quite a long time with, one of Putin's complaints seems to be that, well, the Americans do this all the time. So why not? I read that he was not very happy with the Iraq 2003 situation, and he's using it as a kind of, justifier. So the rest of us who are neither Ukrainian nor Russian have some kind of responsibility or interest or something in moving beyond this interventionist kind of, if you've got enough firepower, you can intervene, particularly if the US or Russia. And I suppose eventually there could be others in that small club who can do what they want, and the rest of us have to look on or even make some money selling them armaments. But the person that I've been reading is Gandhi in the last 6 or 8 months, a lot. I've reread his so-called autobiography, My Experiences with Truth. And I've been trying to understand what he means by truth, which is way more central to his thinking than nonviolence. Nonviolence is a kind of expression of truth. So
that you want to swing that, you want to give that a try, because it's been probably 30 something years since I read that book, and I know what you're pointing to something important. But if somebody asked me what Gandhi's notion of truth is, I wouldn't be able to tell them. Can you make a try? And maybe Arthur knows too.
Yeah, no, this is good, because I would have to say exactly what you said. I don't know. And I keep Googling Satyagraha, and I keep rereading excerpts, and I'm finding myself, which is the wonder of the internet, reading issues of whatever, I don't know, India Youth, whatever the magazine he published way back when was. Because, if you want to find out what Satyagraha is, he talks about it off and on in all kinds of odd places. So this is how Scientology connects in a way. I'm not going to go down that road very far, but we like to think arbitrarily of 8 dynamics which cover all of existence. So the first dynamic is you surviving. The second dynamic is family, sex, children, that whole range, schools even, I suppose. Third dynamic is groups. Fourth dynamic is mankind, which is where we are in this discussion. I think we're mainly focused on what I would call the fourth dynamic. And Gandhi, fifth dynamic, is other life forms. It goes on, right? Spiritual and cultural things and so on. But Gandhi was mainly involved in a third dynamic struggle, in my way of thinking. That is, India against Britain, or the Indian population of South Africa against the government. And that's the way we tend to frame these things. In Gene Sharp's examples, it's if you're being invaded, but it's not about if your next door neighbor is being invaded. What's your responsibility if your next door neighbor is being invaded? And Poland is doing its part, and I guess Belarus is doing its part, and so on. But even on the other end of the planet, we have our part to do from the point of view of humanity, and things like the UN Declaration on Human Rights, if you take it seriously, is actually being violated every time somebody dies, even if they're a soldier. But this is something that concerns me, and what do we do about it? And I'm wondering if there isn't some way of extrapolating Gandhi's understanding and tactics to apply to intervening in wars that are not involving your own country. And of course, this is another one of the complaints. I was in Beijing in 1989, just before and just after the Tiananmen Square thing. And these protests are basically usually the population struggling against the government, their own government. And when you get NGOs involved, that's grounds for complaint. George Soros stirring the pot in Eastern Europe, that kind of thing.
By the way, Gene Sharp himself was in Tiananmen Square just hours before it happened.
Wow.
And I did an interview with him and somebody else who was there, had been there. I can't remember who the other person was, but he was talking about going around in the square talking to people because they didn't know how to, how to do a nonviolent struggle. A lot of them, he said, they had a thirst strike. They went on strike. They were not going to eat. That's reasonable, but you can't go on strike against water because you can't live very many hours without water. So they had no preparation, and it was later that he made a book, I think a booklet at least, which may have been one of his major ones, but I can't remember which ones. Maybe Arthur remembers. A book that was meant to be kind of a handbook for novices in various countries that wanted to put on demonstrations and stuff. But he had just been a few hours before in the square wandering around talking to those people. So you were in Beijing at the same time as Jean.
By accident, yeah. And I wasn't involved in the peace movement at that time. I come and go. I don't know. I had a different game I was playing at that moment. Yeah. I was thinking of the Salt March, actually, and whether there would be some way that in a war zone, whether it's Ukraine or Uganda or where, there could be some kind of a protest march, I guess you would call it that, but that was not, the subjects of some oppressive government marching to escape oppression, but was the subjects of a psychotic international relations scene.
Think back to the first Iraq War. And Jean Drèze, who later wrote, or maybe had already written a book with Amartya Sen, which really got Amartya Sen the Nobel Prize for economics, about showing that famine doesn't occur in democratic countries. Anyway, they were co-authors, and they have continued to work together in various ways. But Jean Drèze is an Indian citizen now. He came through trying to raise money for a Gulf peace camp. And I lent him some money, which, I think $6,000, and by golly, he repaid it over the years, which I didn't expect. But they set up, and several people from Canada went there. They set up a camp between the two armies because the invasion didn't happen instantly. It took a while for them to set it up. And I've forgotten what country they were in, but they were across the border. And so they had this Gulf peace team, which set a camp up and were going to simply interpose themselves between the two sides and say, we're not moving. You can't go any further unless you're going to run over us. Well, that lasted 5 minutes. I mean, the American army came along and just put these guys up and put them in a truck and drove them off. There was it didn't faze them a bit. So that didn't work. But the idea of interposing a third party between two combatants, and it has been used for peacekeepers. Peacekeepers have sometimes been sent to interpose themselves between two camps. That I think would have worked maybe in the Libya situation, as I recall. Was it Libya, where these two armed forces were? They were going to meet someplace and engage. And if the peacekeepers had got there in time and just put themselves there in between them, they could have probably stopped it. But, the UN is never really ready because it takes about 6 months to get a UN peacekeeping operation on the ground wherever they need to go. And so they need to have some kind of short-term emergency service that's just owned by the UN and ready to go at a drop of a hat. If they'd had that, they might have been able to do it, but they didn't have anybody who could do it at the time.
How many people were at that peace camp?
I don't know. Not 1,000, I think. It was in the desert. I think they were living in tents, and they were there several weeks.
So you'd have to have more people than the army could comfortably scoop up.
More than they could have scooped up. Yeah. I mean, that's the trick, isn't it? Your demonstrations are effective if it's the number of people is enough. That's true. Mhm.
With Gandhi again, I'm not an expert on the Salt March. I'm trying to learn more about it in my spare time, but I haven't looked at it for many months now. But as I recall, he started with 79 people. That's for sure. And there were 79 people who knew what Satya was, so they didn't have to discuss what's the nature of truth and what Satyagraha was, why it's forceful. And they weren't people you would have to worry about getting angry and taking a swing at an opponent. So they were well trained. But as the march moved, and I've forgotten now, but I think it was like maybe 26 days or something, a month or more, it grew and people were attracted to it who weren't so educated in what it was they were doing. I don't know how that would fit it's not so much interposing between warring forces. It's a different thing. It's a kind of putting yourself in the way of being arrested, rather like the civil rights scene, or in the way of being physically harmed, but not necessarily trying to keep two sides apart. I mean, Gandhi just walked however far it was, I've forgotten, 300 kilometers or something over many, many days. And every day, I'm sure the British, colonial government got more nervous because he had good connections. You would need someone, I suppose, who's already a bit scary to the warring parties. It's a different world where you've got, Ukraine is not a pacifist country, right? It's not as if Putin is the only person with weaponry going.
I think maybe more relevant to Ukraine would be something like his boycott, where you remember there was a time when he said, we will have a day of fasting and prayer, and everybody in India will stay home. So the value of that is nobody went out and clashed with the police and nobody got beaten up. They were simply staying at home, fasting and praying. But it was an overwhelming, you could keep that up a very long time. And it was a real threat to the regime, to the Raj. Do you remember the details about that, either of you? I think I get half of my information from the movie, which I used to show to my class. When I was teaching at the U of T, I had a program in peace and conflict studies, and I had one course on nonviolence every year. One of the things I would show is that film. And so my memory of Gandhi is more colored by Ben Kingsley than by Gandhi, I guess.
Well, my memory of Henry V is colored by Shakespeare, so it's a long-standing problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just occurring to me that maybe Ukraine has a lot of advantages, actually, also. Even though it's not officially a pacifist country, they do share much in their culture with Russia. Many people speak Russian, maybe a majority of people. And they're right next door. And, maybe Ukrainians could march into Russia, for example, in a peaceful way, and really disrupt the sort of narrative that's happening in Russia. Because I think that's one of the things that sustains the war, is that Putin's domestic propaganda is fairly successful. He's able to suppress most dissenting voices in Russia. But if you could have a big enough protest and even bring it into Russia itself, it could really, that's, I think, his biggest vulnerability might be actually that Russians decide to oust him. And so somehow I think that would be really interesting to think about how Ukrainians could help make that happen. And it probably isn't going to work if they denounce Russia as a country or denounce Russians as people and act as though they're the enemy. So that's really fundamental to this, right? Is that they have to divide Putin from from the Russian people somehow. And that is the advantage of nonviolent struggle, or one of the big advantages is that you can avoid setting up this dynamic where you're the enemy of your oppressor's soldiers.
Mm. Yeah. I don't know whether you can march Ukrainians into Russia. That's even harder sell than the idea of organizing anti-war Russians or Ukrainians who happen to live in Russia, because you're right, the population is all intermixed, and so on. But the name of the game is to get rid of Putin, and if the Russians put their mind to it, it's really their problem. It's up to them to get rid of this guy. But it's so disappointing to see how compliant they are, and it's not unusual. I remember thinking back to, during the days when all the color revolutions were taking place. And I made a count at one time of how many people would come to a demonstration in the streets. And of course, we had the example of Belgrade, where the streets were filled one day with some hundreds of thousands of people. And Milosevic just, said he gave up. But, in Russia, you would have a demonstration and they might get 1,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 people. In Moscow it would be a good 10 times the size or more of Belgrade. Moscow had 10, 12 million people. And so, they're just not, and so many of the people I know in Russia are reluctant to take a position contrary to their government, even if they totally disagree with what the government's doing. It's really hard to get a large number of Russians to take, and it may just simply be that they had their revolution and whatever else, we don't want to do that again, That may be all that's behind it. But, I had a conversation yesterday with Alex Neve, who is was the head of Amnesty International in Canada. And we were talking about how the problem really is that when you have a dictator or a criminal ruler like Putin, who maybe just one person was all it took. When he had so much control, he was able to launch this war against Ukraine and make everybody agree to it and accept it. I mean, I don't doubt that it was all his doing. So we have this one guy who's violated international law. So the International Court of Justice has a meeting right away, and they say, "Stop it! Get out of there! You pull your troops out." And of course, it doesn't make a bit of difference. I mean, he is not going to pay the slightest attention to that. So the point is that when it comes to violating international law, which is certainly war like genocide or aggression and sort of thing, but it should also be wars, violations of environmental law. I mean, I would like to have somebody go arrest Manchin in the U.S. who's blocking, Biden's only hope of being able to stop global warming with U.S. money. He should be arrested. He's violating international law. So why don't we have an enforcement mechanism? And on the one hand, we need a mechanism that could go and say, well, we're going to stop this guy while he's in the act, rather than wait until later and put him on trial after the war is over and after he's killed all these people. We're going to stop him right now. So we need a police force. Well, we're not going to have an international police force, I don't think. But we could say it's really the Russian people who put this guy in power. So it's up to the Russians to get rid of him. And we should have a mechanism for authorizing them to do so. We don't want to authorize every renegade or every outfit that decides to launch a coup against their government. But when a ruler is doing something that's contrary to international law, we should have a procedure for bringing it to the International Court of Justice and then having their approval vetted by, let's say, 2 other UN bodies like the General Assembly, or maybe if we had a parliamentary assembly, something like that. Then if we had 2 or 3 different UN bodies say, yeah, for sure, this guy's illegal and he needs to be ousted. Then a group of people who are Russian, who have an idea of how to get rid of him, can appeal to them and say, can you authorize us to do it? And with that, then all of the Russian population would be notified. Your responsibility is to help anybody who's trying to get rid of Putin and bring him to trial. Ideally, bring him to trial. So this would authorize a change in regime based on UN bodies that are global in scope, but carried out by Russians rather than an international police force, which I think would be resented by most people. They're not going to want anybody invading them to, use military force to oust their regime. But how about something like that?
Wow, I never heard that idea before.
I just cooked it up last week.
I mean, I can think of some political difficulties with that because it sort of goes against the idea of self-determination, right? To say the outsiders are going to decide whether you have a legitimate government, and we're going to then authorize maybe a minority group, like some group of colonels or something, to overthrow the government. And that feels, I mean, I only thought about it for 30 seconds, but that feels like that can be problematic.
Sure.
And maybe it could be seen as, I mean, we saw how sort of regime change has gone in the past few decades from outside. And so maybe inside you're also essentially triggering potentially civil wars, and a lot of nasty things could happen inside the country, right? So
that's exactly why you really want to make sure you've got this global authorization down absolutely rock solid. That's why you'd need maybe 3 different UN bodies or something to authorize it, so that it's not some you do not want to authorize some crackpot people on their own to start a civil war, and it could be that kind of thing. But if you could tell the Russian people, the entire rest of the world has taken a position that we will assist people in every way possible, short of sending military invasion, to change your regime. And as a world citizen, you Russian citizens have an obligation to make sure that your government is conforming to international law. And therefore, it's your obligation to support this outfit that we have authorized, because we've looked into what they plan to do and how they're going to go about it, and their intentions of trying to keep it nonviolent as much as possible, and that sort of thing. So we think this is the best thing that we can do to bring peace to the world and prevent this war or this genocide, which is impending. And so your obligation is to support a change in regime. You brought him to power, now you get rid of him.
I think it's tough in the sense that I think Russians are also victims of Putin. So you're putting a lot of responsibility on people who are really his victims. And I'm quite interested in.
Well, yeah, but I mean, sorry, but I don't want to interrupt, but I do. Because yes, they are victims, but they are enablers. They saw all along. It's like the U.S. is being a victim of Trump. Well, yeah, but and we are all victims of Trump and his policies about global warming or whatever.
Yeah.
But the US people brought him to power, and they might even bring him back to power. So they have a responsibility to conform to international law. So they're not just victims. They may be victims, but that's no excuse.
I see it as a little different in the sense that Trump was kind of elected, maybe not by a majority, but more or less by the rules. And in Russia, I don't know if Putin has ever been really elected. Maybe he has. It's unclear, right?
He would have been elected 10 times more readily than Trump, because the support for him has been overwhelming. It's slipped at various times, but it's way higher than any Western leader would ever expect to get in a democracy.
But can we know that under the conditions that?
I think it's true. Even back, at a time when I didn't want to believe it was true. Of course, I don't want to believe it now, but things like the Levada. Levada is a polling institution that is an honest one. And when they say something's true, I tend to believe them where I wouldn't necessarily believe some of the others. But, we're talking 80% approval ratings.
Do they do any surveying in China?
No, not Levada.
Is there any reliable surveying that comes out of China?
I don't know.
I'm just wondering with leaders and elections, one of the issues is democracy, quote, right? And my authority on democracy is Leonard Cohen, pretty much. It's coming to the USA someday. It's the most hopeful place that democracy might finally arrive. But you don't know that song,
No.
Check it out.
No, I don't know the song.
It's from the 90s. I think you mentioned world citizen, and that's an interesting concept in all of this, because my fixation is really on China. That's where I was for a decade, a long time ago, and I have a lot of interest in it. And the current things I'm running into, which is how do I contact a Russian person or a Ukrainian person, is multiplied in terms of how do I contact a Chinese person, even if I happen to have taught that Chinese person 50 years ago and therefore have the altitude of a Shifu, his teacher, and all that Confucian respect, which still exists. So the insistence on whether a leader is legitimate by whatever criterion is a complicated one. And I'm not too hopeful about making any progress in this conversation on that topic. Maybe we could, but I am interested in what our responsibilities as world citizens are. I guess probably we're probably all Americans. Is that fair to say? I am.
I am.
Yeah. So when I say we or they, Ukrainians are they to some degree, and Russians are even more they right now. And for most of my friends, the Chinese are really they compared to when I first went there, when they were kind of more toward we. But if you think about our responsibility as human beings, as world citizens, and what mechanisms we've got at the present moment, these I think are maybe evolving in the right direction over time. But the UN at least still exists, so it's still there after 80 years or whatever, but it's still pretty impotent in situations like this, it seems to me. But maybe world citizens aren't, and maybe this is where Arthur. You're more. Are you Art or Arthur?
Both.
Okay, well, both were. I'm in touch with somebody in Moscow right now, whose English is really good. But I asked about machine translation, and he said that a while ago, machine translation was terrible, And he's in that field, and he said they used to talk about Google Translate as a kind of, term of abuse. Oh, what you just did is a Google Translate, but that's not true now. And in fact, it's very high standards, I would say, from his point of view. But I don't use it. So, is there a likelihood that in the near future, any of us who just idly want to get in touch with a real human being in a country whose language we don't speak can do it kind of at random, or have Zoom meetings? I mean, the problems of security are big. I don't dare say very much to my Chinese friends. And, I'm very cautious right now with my one Russian connection.
But now what you do speak Chinese?
A little bit, but no, not really.
You couldn't use it for your conversation.
No, I couldn't function there. But there are two issues. One is understanding each other. The other one is security,
Right. Yes.
of the person you're speaking to. But right now, leaving the security aside, is it conceivable to have schmoozes like this with three people who don't understand one another, and at the end of the hour could somehow be understanding one another?
Well, I think that you don't need to go that far. There are so many people now in Russia, and I can't say that's true of China, but it may be, who do speak English now. For example, I have a sociology professor friend who was teaching until COVID, half of the year in Moscow at the Higher School of Economics, which is probably the best university in Russia now, and half of the year at U of T. And he gives all his classes in English in Russia. And they're not, it's not to study English, it's that everybody knows that if you want to be an international person, you have to be able to function in English. So it's easy enough to contact people. Even high school students know some English. And it's not difficult to find Russians who speak English. And I can even help with that. As a matter of fact, last week I had a show with Rainer Brown, the IPB Secretary General now, International Peace Bureau. And we were talking about exactly that, setting up conversations between Russians and Westerners in English. And I've done some reaching out, but I haven't been able to contact the people I tried to contact who could help us set up Zoom conversations precisely of that kind, to have a conversation just between, let's say, Canadians and Russians. I hope I'll be able to do that, but I don't know whether that would satisfy you. Is it important to you that the people you talk to be only Russian speakers?
No, I'm thinking just very generally. I mean, this year it's Russia and Ukraine, right? 10 years ago, it was some other mess, and 20 years from now, it will be some other mess. And either more and more people will be speaking English or whatever, so you can use a kind of lingua franca, whatever it is. But there's a very funny movie I saw recently. I don't know. My wife discovers obscure movies, so maybe you know of it and maybe you don't. It's Indian, and it's called RRR, I think. Triple R. It's a very bizarre film. But one of the issues in it is that it's a kind of action, weird Bollywood dancing mix of insanity, political stuff. But the two of the main characters are heroes, one of whom is a quote, I guess, Aboriginal or whatever the term that's appropriate in India is, tribal, somebody who doesn't speak English. And his counterpart is in the military, speaks English. And they're both multilingual, but one of them doesn't include English in his multilingual abilities. And there's a huge amount of humor that comes out of how differently the world looks to these two people. And in fact, of the 8 billion people on Earth, most of them still don't speak English or understand English, more to the point. And if they do so in varying degrees, So if one could have just totally random tool, like the transcoder or whatever it is, where you could just speak with anybody, no matter what their ability is, then you'd be less limited to that subset of human beings who, have enough English to function. That's all. Be an interesting thing.
Was your Russian friend suggesting a written interaction that translates, or oral?
We haven't gotten that.
I've never had any experience with the latter, but I go on Facebook and you can have everything translated from Russian into English. He may be a little glorifying how good they are, because I find there are many times when I don't quite get what they're saying. I can get the drift of it, but often I'm sure that it would be, if I had a real conversation with somebody, it would not work.
That's the issue. Yeah, sure. I've fooled around with it a tiny, tiny bit, maybe 3 hours in my entire life.
Right.
And I was not impressed with the results.
Yeah.
But this person has obviously spent a lot more time on it. We didn't get so far as to distinguish between the two, but I suspect he's speaking mainly about print rather than live.
Well, even if you see these automatic translations that the machine does from English to text, you can see it on TV sometimes. And we have a thing called Otter, which, in fact, our show right now, I might put it through Otter and it would produce a transcript of what we have said. But every now and then there'd be a word that would be not at all said,
Yeah.
You have to go through to change things like people's names, and often there are other words that are not going to work. So
yeah, for sure. If you don't know what they're saying, the line at the bottom of the screen is probably not going to tell you.
Yeah. Well, have we made any progress? Do we have any agreement at all about how we're going to solve Ukraine and, China?
We all agree to some. We all like nonviolence, but we might all be wrong as well. So that's the problem, right?
I think what we're dealing with, the issue we've tried to tackle, how we could use nonviolence to bring an end to this war, to me, is the most frustrating part of it, because before a war, all the peace people I know have wonderful ideas, any one of which would help to reduce the probability of a war. But once you've got a war going on, we're absolutely useless at stopping it, And I have nothing to say that I think will help. So all I can think of is, I hope the right side wins, because somebody's going to either win or it'll be a draw. And at the end, a lot of people are going to be dead because of it. Our time's up, friends. Thank you both. I've enjoyed this. So
thank you. So bye.
Okay, you take care. Bye.
Bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode number 479. You can watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. We eventually even post the transcripts there. And when you get there, look around, please, because we have conversations there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.